Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The U.S. has raised tariffs on Chinese goods to 145%, escalating an economic standoff that's already reshaping global trade. For South Korea, the ripple effects are immediate. Over half of its semiconductor exports go to China, and a significant share of its intermediate goods are embedded in Chinese exports, now facing steep U.S. barriers. At the same time, Beijing is courting Asian partners and reviving its vision of a shared destiny in Asia. For Seoul, that means a complex recalibration, economic alignment with the U.S., regional interdependence with China, and rising competition across Southeast Asia. And Within the Frame tonight, we examine how these shifts are challenging South Korea's economic resilience, diplomatic strategy, and industrial future. For this, we invite Dr. Bong Young-sik, Research Fellow at Yonsei University Institute for North Korean Studies, here in the studio with us. Welcome, Dr. Bong.
You're welcome.
And also joining us online is Jeff Moon, president of China Moon Strategies at LLC and former assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China. Great to have you.
Thank you.
So let's start our discussion with Mr. Moon. With U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, like I said, hitting 145%, how do you assess the economic implications for South Korea, especially as Korean intermediate goods now flow heavily into Chinese export industries?
These are unprecedented times, and there's great uncertainty in world markets. But U.S.-Korea relations are solid, and it's important to remember that although tariffs on China may impact Korea somewhat, Korea is not a primary target in the current trade war. The U.S. and Korea negotiated the U.S.-Korea trade agreement in 2012 and then updated that agreement in 2019 during President Trump's first term. The U.S. and Korea are also treaty allies that have a close national security relationship. And I think that friendship probably explains why Treasury Secretary Bessent said this week that Korea is on his priority list of countries for reciprocal tariff negotiations. The Korean trade minister visited last week and will probably be in Washington again next week for discussions with his counterparts. So I think that prospects for an eventual agreement between the U.S. and Korea look good.
So we could expect some room for negotiations on that front. Now let's also bring in Dr. Bong to the conversation. So in response to this pressure, President Xi Jinping is emphasizing a community of shared destiny with neighboring countries. What does this shift suggest about China's evolving diplomatic strategy, and how might this reshape Korea-China relations moving forward?
For the past 80 plus years, since the end of the Second World War and the creation of the contemporary free market global economic order, South Korea has been one of the major beneficiaries alongside with the United States, Japan, and other free market economies. So South Korea's choice is very clear and straightforward. It's not about choosing China over the United States or United States over China, but South Korea needs to make its own share of contribution to support the international regime that has been so beneficial to South Korea and beneficial to the overall growth of the world economy since 1945. So South Korea's reactions to the current situation must be based upon the basic principles of the free and fair trade and global capitalism. It's not just choosing one economy over the other. Having said that, if China wants to have Korea on board for the community of shared destiny, if I may cite President Xi Jinping's own word, then that concept of the community of shared destiny does not only apply to China, South Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, or any other countries, but all the participating economies to global economy are members of the community of shared destiny. So it is time for all the main actors in the global economy to come to common sense and what has made them so prosperous and successful for the past history.
Right. So staying with this topic of community of shared destiny, Dr. Bong, could you tell us also about the implications of China strengthening its partnerships with ASEAN nations? And also, could you also tell us how South Korea could position itself?
Both China and the United States needs to collect their own partners to shore up their response to each other in this trade war. Think about it, imposing 145% or imposing 125%. This is unprecedented in recent history of global economy. So it is a beginning of the war of attrition. So China and the United needs to bring closer to their size, their potential partners. So that makes these ASEAN economies, alongside with South Korea, Japan, even more attractive and important to them. And South Korea needs to make the right choices because its dependency upon trade, calculated as its proportion to GDP, is as high as any other countries. It hovers around the 68 to 69% of its GDP, 2.5 times bigger than that of Japan, and 3.5 times bigger than United States, because these two economies has a bigger domestic markets. So it is important for South Korea to make the right choice, which in a way to somehow help to make the right contributions to ease out the danger of the global recession as a result, likely result of the trade war between two biggest economies in the world.
Right, so it would be a very important decision to make. Now, from an industrial perspective now, Mr. Moon, could China's growing influence in the ASEAN lead to supply chain displacement for South Korea? And could you also tell us how should South Korean firms rethink their strategy in the region to stay as competitive?
China's industrial strategy is to boost employment at home by subsidizing Chinese firms that then create overcapacity. China disadvantages companies throughout the Asia region, including in Korea, when Chinese firms then sell those products below cost. That causes other companies that can't compete to go out of business, leaving the Chinese to capture market share. Governments around the world, including in Korea, have become increasingly aware of these Chinese abuses in recent years and are pushing back to defend markets and supply chains. Anti-dumping cases have become increasingly common around the world as Chinese overcapacity increases. South Korea has filed anti-dumping cases against China at home and can support the efforts of neighbors in their supply chain to defend themselves in the same way. Meanwhile, I see that Korea is taking steps to support its semiconductor industry at home. I see, for example, that the government announced just yesterday an increase in the government support fund for the industry to a total of $23.5 billion US.
So Korea's industrial edge in the region may no longer be a given, and strategic retooling sounds more urgent than optional. Now, as ASEAN becomes a contested space in the new Cold War landscape, we've talked about this a while ago, we need to have the right choice, Dr. Bong. How can South Korea avoid marginalization and maintain diplomatic and economic balance between the U.S. and China?
Of course, there's a substantial danger for South Korea to be marginalized or squeezed between China and the United States. But this collision between two biggest economies in the world economy actually, may create the room for opportunity and strategic benefits of South Korea. Because South Korea is a very important, indispensable piece for both China and the United States for realization their respective strategic and economic gains. For instance, for the success of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States, which is bipartisan strategy of the United States, and South Korea's participation in the reformulation of the force deployment and strategic plans of the United States is essential. And there has been a discussion advanced by the Trump administration about changing the basic missions and the strategic posture of the U.S. forces stationing in South Korea to better cope with the threat in the Taiwan Strait away from the Korean Peninsula. So South Korea's support for this reformulation of the strategic vision of the United States is very essential, a critical component of the success of that change. So South Korea definitely has a leverage. And in the context of trade war between United States and China, the decision made by South Korea in couple of the bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations with the United States and China will have a very important ripple effects upon the next stage of the trade competition and war between United States and China. Given the erratic behavior of the Trump administration with many back and forth and backpedaling decisions after the declaration of the tariff policies, then it is not a good time for South Korea to rush into a hasty decision because there is still a great deal of uncertainty in the U.S. economy and the U.S. government as well as the global economy. So wait and see must be the right choice for South Korea, at least for a while. We are going to elect a new president in 60 days, but the reciprocal tariff on South Korea has been on pause for 90 days. So the interim President Han Duck-soo still afford to take extra time without making any definite agreement with the United States. So his mission is not to make any early agreement with the United States that is not satisfactory to the next president who will be in governance for the next 5 years. It is not about making agreement with the United States early, but making right type of agreement with the United States that can be acceptable to the next president for the next 5 years.
Right. So as of now, we have 2 months, less than 2 months to go until the next presidential election. We can have to wait and see until what happens. Now, with around 60% of South Korea's semiconductor exports going to China and tech dependence on the U.S., Mr. Moon, how do you think this dual overdependence could be reduced in a sustainable way?
The semiconductor sector is undergoing great change, and the greatest threat to Korean semiconductor firms with respect to China is the imminent prospect of Chinese overcapacity. Broadly speaking, there are two kinds of semiconductors. Korea produces advanced semiconductors that are used for artificial intelligence and other advanced applications, and Korea will have no problem selling those chips for the foreseeable future. But with regard to legacy semiconductors, which are used for household appliances and less sophisticated applications, the prospects are different. China has prioritized manufacturing of these less sophisticated chips, is providing massive subsidies, and will soon flood international markets with chips sold below cost. On April the 1st, President Trump initiated a Section 232 investigation into the semiconductor market that could result in tariffs to address these problems. Korea can defend and promote its semiconductor industry by supporting and perhaps joining these and other efforts in Asia to resist the Chinese overcapacity problem in the semiconductor sector.
Now, U.S. export controls and China's countermeasures are disrupting high-tech supply chains as well. Mr. Moon, how should Korean leaders at firms like Samsung and SK hynix navigate this strategic split in the global tech ecosystem?
Export controls govern dual-use items that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. On the one hand, everyone wants to promote the sale and use of technologies that are useful for civilian purposes. On the other hand, however, we all want to prevent those technologies from being used to create weapons. For example, artificial intelligence improves weather forecasting models in useful ways, but that technology can also be used to create military applications like bioweapons. China poses a special threat because Beijing has a military-civilian fusion policy that promotes the use of civilian technologies for military purposes. So Korea must make difficult choices as it balances civilian versus military uses of dual-use technologies. But past Chinese political and economic aggression, I think, teaches us that Korea's long-term interests are best served by alignment on export control policies with the United States and its allies.
Right, so a little bit more focus on exports with the United States could be helpful. Now, let's also touch upon the currency issue, Dr. Bong. The weakening yuan is dragging down the Korean won, people say. Do you think this is just a currency ripple or a deeper sign of somewhat a strategic vulnerability in Korea's financial independence?
Of course, South Korea's trade is critically subject to the exchange rates with major trading partners such as China and the United States. So the strategic vulnerability is there because of the South Korea's trading relations with China. But at the same time, China is likely to make strategic decision upon the appreciation or depreciation of its own currency, yuan, to US dollars, if there will be a full-blown trade war after the imposition of the reciprocal tariffs by both sides, United States and China. So it is critically dependent upon the next strategic move taken by Washington and Beijing in the context of the exchange rate decision by Washington and Beijing. Then South Korea's response will be affected by this change. In order to make kind of strategic concessions to Washington, assuming there will be a higher level discussion and negotiation between Beijing and Washington to avert a major economic crisis for both economies. And China may be likely to make some concessions about the appreciation of yuan to US dollars to make some appeasement to Washington in exchange for the concessions made by the Trump administration. So there's a hopeful development which may alleviate the strategic burden for South Korea.
So given all this, Dr. Bong, even despite the leadership vacancy, South Korea had been working to tackle these problems. Do you think South Korea's current diplomatic and corporate strategies are enough in this kinds of global realignment? And what do you think, what kind of gaps or blind spots need some attention as of the moment?
As I said, the making an early agreement with the U.S. Is not the right course of action for South Korea. It is making the right type of agreement with the United States that is acceptable to the next president, who will be in charge of the governance for 5 years. So South Korean negotiation team must tell its American counterpart clearly that any sloppy agreement is not acceptable because it will not be respected and supported by the new government of South Korea anyway. So there will be a reasonable respect for South Korea's own interest in the bilateral trade negotiation, because it is not South Korea but Trump administration unilaterally and without any scientific evidence accused of South Korea of violating the bilateral free trade agreement. Those evidence is not really based upon scientific evidence. So it is very politically driven. And the United States is paying the cost of this tariff bombs. And it is highly unlikely for the U.S. government to sustain these extreme measures, considering the backlash on domestic politics on its own companies, small business owners and consumers. So South Korea needs to be very objective in the spirit of the respect for, basic principle of free trade, free and fair trade in a truest sense. So South Korea does not need to rush into any early agreement with the United States.
Right. So in the next government, thorough discussions to come up with a respectful agreement would be great. Now to Dr. Moon, before we let you go, if you were to advise the next Korean administration, what kind of trade and industrial policy priorities would you set to ensure Korea's strategic resilience through 2025 and beyond?
I think I would urge Korean leaders to look for ways to build on the success of KORUS. Korea and the U.S. are now beginning reciprocal tariff negotiations, and I hope those talks can be wrapped up quickly. An important aspect of those discussions will be non-tariff barriers. Just last month, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative issued its 2025 National Trade Estimate Report on foreign trade barriers. That report focuses on non-tariff barriers in all countries, including Korea. The Korea chapter suggests various areas for follow-up discussions. So relevant issues include things like technical barriers to trade, services sectors issues, digital trade barriers, investment restrictions, and sectors like autos. The Trump administration is going to raise these issues during reciprocal tariff negotiations in the coming weeks. So I urge the next Korean government to review those policy areas with the goal of finding ways for us to work together more effectively.
Right. So thorough review, and we will have to wait until the next administration that comes, but we will have to prepare for that, of course. Now, we will have to end our discussion at this point. Thank you so much for your insights and for your time, Dr. Bong. And Mr. Moon, we appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.